This podcast contains adult themes and graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
A commercial-free version of this podcast is available on Patreon for $1 per month. Patreon.com/Beyond Contempt podcast. I'm Renee, and this is Beyond Contempt True Crime. Mental illness has touched most everyone's life, whether it's a coworker, friend, or family member. Some of us have even dealt with a loved one who has schizophrenia. People with serious mental illness issues are usually not violent. However, a tiny subset commit violent crimes. But we are uncertain how much mental illness plays into the violence versus other factors. This is, unfortunately, one of those stories. You're listening to episode 27, Hadden Clark. Hadden Irving Clark entered the world on July 31, 1952, in Troy, New York, and was one of 4 children in the Clark family. His birth was not a simple one. They pulled him out with a pair of forceps, which reportedly caused a head injury. Hadden experienced problems with walking and often fell, hitting his head. Hadden Sr. had his doctorate and worked as an engineer at a gas company. He was a veteran of the Korean War. Hadden's mother, Flavia, stayed home with the kids. The Clark household was fraught with dysfunction. The family lived in a large 2-story colonial house in Warren, New Jersey, and one childhood friend recalled that yelling was heard constantly from the Clark family home. Hadden Sr. was manic-depressive and often got physical with his wife. Flavia was a woman who was always mentally and physically on the go. She drank heavily just so she could calm down and fall asleep. One of the Clark children explained that their parents were functioning alcoholics. At age 4, doctors diagnosed Hadden with cerebral palsy. This is a disorder that impacts a person's balance and movement. It is caused by a brain injury, or the brain doesn't develop as it should. Hadden went to therapy to help with this condition, but he would still fall all the time. His mother even taped his head in a feeble attempt to subvert more damage. Hadden had learning difficulties and was delayed a few years before he started kindergarten. His time in school was not pleasant. He had a speech impediment, so kids teased and bullied him. His parents decided to send him to another public school for the learning disabled. When Hadden turned 14, he went to private school. Hadden Clark was described many ways by the people who grew up with him. He was a quiet loner, eccentric, mischievous, standoffish, compulsively yearned for social acceptance, lacked social skills, displayed immaturity, could not relate to his peers, lacked self-control, was clever especially when he played chess but was slow in school, enjoyed the outdoors, overreacted to the tiniest of criticisms, snapped over tiny transgressions, and went through periods of depression. One of Hadden's pastimes was to cross-dress. Female garments in the Clark household often went missing. Flavia would catch Hadden in her undergarments. One time Hadden was doing yard work for a neighbor, and he was caught wearing the woman's nightgown. Right before he turned 20, Hadden graduated high school. He enrolled in the Culinary Institute of America in New York and graduated 2 years later. Hadden experienced difficulties keeping a job. From 1974 to 1982, he worked at 12 different kitchen jobs where he was fired or he quit. In 1982, at age 30, Hadden enlisted in the Navy and became a cook on a Navy ship. During that time, Hadden's older brother, Bradfield, had a female co-worker over to his house for dinner in June 1984. Reportedly, Brad said something inappropriate to his dinner guest, which resulted in her slapping him. The incident began as a struggle and ended up with Brad dismembering her body, wrapping the parts in trash bags and packing them into his car. There was evidence that Brad grilled and consumed some parts of the victim. They convicted Brad of murder, and the judge gave him 18 years to life. Shortly after, trouble emerged for Hadden in 1985, when he had a series of incidents where it was apparent that his mental health was faltering. After his Navy ship pulled into Portsmouth, Virginia, Hadden found himself detained in the airport. The Navy said he exhibited bizarre activity, but the report did not elaborate further. Since this was prior to 9/11, his actions must have been significant enough that the airport security noticed him. Later on, that same bizarre behavior surfaced again and resulted in him destroying property at a local store. They required Hadden to meet with a Navy psychiatrist. He claimed that he blacked out in the store and didn't remember what took place. Hadden said that his bizarre behavior started after his Navy shipmates had beaten him until he blacked out. Hadden thought they envied him and his exceptional cooking abilities. Paranoid schizophrenia, manifested by persecutory and grandiose delusions, was the diagnosis issued to him from the psychiatrist. The Navy discharged Hadden on June 22, 1985, and sent him to the Veterans Administration Hospital for treatment. After the VA, he headed to Silver Spring, Maryland, to stay with his brother Jeffrey and niece Elizabeth. His brother thought Hadden's behavior was troubling before he signed on with the Navy, but his problems were undeniable after his military discharge. In May 1986, Hadden was carrying full-on conversations with himself. Rambling words dribbled out of his mouth and were tinged with hostility. Jeffrey reached his limit with Hadden. Jeffrey's girlfriend was fearful and didn't want to be around her future brother-in-law, so Jeffrey asked Hadden to move out by the end of May. Once Hadden left his brother's house, his rap sheet grew. In 1985, he committed a petty theft, stealing bras and underwear from an area store. They never made a judgment because the case was placed on inactive docket. That meant that the defendant did not show up for their hearing. In 1986, the Clarks experienced another tragic event when the Clark family patriarch, Hadden Sr., committed suicide in his daughter's home. In 1988, Hadden pled no contest and received 1 year of probation along with mandatory counseling for assaulting his mother. Hadden was renting a room in Bethesda, and it was commonplace for him to hide fish heads in various places around the apartment. The stove, chimney, or even the piano were not off limits. In June 1988, as he moved out of the rental, Hadden laid a booby trap over the door, which resulted in black dye running onto the carpet. It was reported that he killed the family's cat in an act of retaliation for asking him to move out. They convicted him of defacing property, and he received another year of probation along with continued counseling. In February 1989, police caught Hadden with a woman's wig and 9 purses he took from church choir members. When police questioned him, he righteously declared, "I'm a woman." His probation officer was worried about Hadden's mental instability and felt the community was not safe. The PO wanted him hospitalized. Hadden was convicted for the theft and was given 3 more years of probation, but was not hospitalized. The probation officer's intuition was accurate. Unfortunately, Hadden Clark had already committed crimes more atrocious than stealing purses during the time that he lived with his brother in 1986. On May 31st, 1986, a 6-year-old Silver Spring, Maryland girl named Michelle Lee Dorr went missing. She was last seen at her father's home. Michelle bounded down the stairs past her father, Carl, who was reading the paper. She flew into the backyard with her pink-ruffled, white polka-dotted swimsuit and headed out to the kiddie wading pool that her father already filled with water. Carl was cleaning up after lunch and sat down to watch TV for a bit since the Indianapolis 500 was on. Later on, he wanted to circulate fresh air through the house since it was absent air conditioning. He opened a few windows and he heard kids playing outside, but he did not see his child. He assumed Michelle was playing at her friend Elizabeth's house, so he didn't think too much about it. Elizabeth Clark was close in age to Michelle and only lived 2 houses away on the same side of the street. Carl looked outside again around 4 p.m. and did not see his daughter. He wasn't concerned because Elizabeth and Michelle would often play together for hours at a time. It was nearing dinner time, and Carl went to Elizabeth's house to collect his daughter after 5:30 p.m. Carl spoke with Elizabeth's father, Jeffrey Clark, and he had not seen Michelle at all that day. Jeffrey and Elizabeth were gone and just returned home around 3 p.m. A feeling of deep panic consumed Carl. He jumped into his truck and canvassed the neighborhood looking for his daughter. At 6:30 p.m., Michelle was still missing, so Carl drove to the police station to file a report. Over the next 2 weeks, police searched the neighborhood around Carl's home. They interviewed neighbors and enlisted cadaver dogs. The police searched from Bethesda to Cape Cod. They interviewed a married couple who lived in the house between Carl and Jeffrey. The couple left their house on the day of Michelle's disappearance around 11:30 a.m. to attend a baptism. As they were on the way out the door, they saw Hadden Clark place a duffel bag in the back of his pickup truck. Police spoke with Jeffrey Clark, and he recommended they look closely at his brother. Their first interview with Hadden Clark took place on June 5, 1986. Detective Wayne Farrell asked Clark about the day of Michelle's disappearance. Clark claimed that he had not seen the little girl, and he had not been home much that day, other than to feed his pet rabbits. He said he biked to work that day. When the detective glanced at Clark's hand, it was bandaged. He claimed to have crashed into a tree while biking. When the detective followed up with Clark's employer, the Chevy Chase Country Club, where he worked as a chef, the time card showed he punched into work at 2:46 p.m. on May 31st. A few days later, on June 8th, the detective interviewed Clark for a second time. Clark said he was at his brother's home from 1:30 p.m. to 1:45 p.m. on the day of Michelle's disappearance. He let a gardener from the neighborhood into the house to use their telephone. This man was later interviewed by police and confirmed he saw a small white female with Clark when he used the phone. His description of Michelle was generic, but it did match the little girl. When Clark was specifically asked about Michelle's disappearance, he proceeded directly to the bathroom where he vomited and cried. Detectives pressed him harder. They wanted to know what he did to Michelle. Clark said that he didn't know, and he may have blacked out. This question caused him great duress, as it resulted in him rocking in his seat as he held his head. Clark asked for and got to speak with a psychiatrist. Then he wanted to leave the police station, and they approved his request. This was the point when police switched their focus from Clark to Michelle's father, Carl, based on what they knew about his history. Michelle was born on October 12, 1976, to Dorothy and Carl Dorr. They were going through a divorce and a custody battle at the time of Michelle's disappearance, with Carl getting his daughter every other weekend. Dorothy and Carl's relationship had not been a healthy one. According to Dorothy, Carl dished out both mental and physical abuse, including pushing her to the ground in front of Michelle. One time, police interrupted their domestic dispute and witnessed Carl slapping Dorothy. The marriage dissolved in 1985, and the split was hard for Michelle. She developed a stammer and could not sleep without grinding her teeth. She even missed a few months of school and had to redo kindergarten. The diagnosis Michelle received was stress from the breakup of her parents. This worried her mom. Michelle didn't seem as happy as some of the other kids her age. It didn't get any easier after the divorce. Carl told Dorothy that he was going to abduct Michelle when she was waiting for the school bus in the morning. He also threatened Dorothy that all he would have to do was make one phone call and her life would end. Dorothy was frightened enough to file for a restraining order in February 1986. Right before Michelle went missing, a judge ruled that Carl needed to pay more child support to his ex-wife, and his payment went from $250 to $400 per month in May 1986. Police believed between the past abuse and the recent increase with his child support payment, Carl had enough of a motive to want his daughter gone. Plus, Dorothy told them that Carl had done it. The day after Michelle went missing, Carl took a polygraph test. The person who administered the test determined that Carl knew more about the disappearance than he was acknowledging. During the interview, police did not mince words with Carl. They let him know that they were aware of how he abused his ex-wife, and they knew he threatened to abduct his daughter. The detectives said they knew that Michelle was dead, and when they found her, they were coming for Carl. He consented to have police search his home, but no evidence turned up. Carl took a second polygraph test on June 7th. The results showed that Carl was telling the truth, and he had not hurt his daughter. Police did not buy this, so they brought him in for a second interview on June 13th. When they asked Carl about the last time he saw his daughter, he wasn't certain, and he said that it could have been after 2 p.m., but he really wasn't sure. Carl had been no stranger to stress. He was fired from 2 jobs in 3 months and was going through a contentious divorce, so he wasn't in the habit of watching a clock when he wasn't working. In August, Carl was hypnotized, and in October, they injected him with truth serum. Police tapped his phone and surveilled Carl and his family, friends, and coworkers. They never found evidence to implicate him in the crime. Carl started having nervous breakdowns. He had not eaten or slept for several days, and his stress threshold had been crossed. After being interviewed by the police back in June, Carl thought he was Jesus and could will Michelle back into existence. This earned him a trip to the hospital, where this event was diagnosed as an acute psychotic episode, brought on by the emotional stress of losing his daughter, the guilt of not having watched her closer, and then being called a suspect by the police. His second breakdown happened in fall 1987. Carl walked into the police station and told them that he could resurrect people, which didn't help him convey his innocence. Officers told Carl that they found the towel he left behind after he killed his daughter by smothering her with it. There was no towel. This was a lie told by police to extract evidence from Carl. He was confused and begged the detectives to believe that he was innocent. Then, they tried to convince Carl that Michelle drowned in the pool, and he hid her body. They pivoted again, and told him that when the towel didn't work, he used his hands to smother her. After a few hours of this line of questioning, the police convinced Carl that he did kill his daughter. Law enforcement called Dorothy and said that her ex-husband smothered their daughter and put her body in the back of his van. They subsequently searched the back of Carl's van and found nothing. Carl had another stay at a psychiatric hospital. This time, his visit lasted several days. In May 1988, Michelle's mother went on America's Most Wanted to advocate for justice for her daughter. On the program, she said that her ex-husband Carl killed their daughter. Carl saw the episode when it aired and immediately drove over to her house. Carl said he knew where Michelle was, and the truth would burn a hole in Dorothy's soul. Carl was never arrested, and Michelle Dorr's case went cold for several years. We're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. Thank you to Best Fiends for sponsoring this episode of Beyond Contempt True Crime. Do you like puzzle games? Do you like to be entertained? Well, I like both of those things. That's why I really enjoy playing Best Fiends. It's a laid-back puzzle game that you play on your phone. I like Best Fiends because they keep it fresh by adding new levels and events every single month. If my writing for this podcast is even half as creative as the characters in this game, then I know I've made the big time. You can search for Thor's hammer with Viking Vincent, paint roses red with Card Soldier Edward, or join the Liberty Regatta with Sailor Bob. And you don't even need to be tethered to Wi-Fi, because you can play without an internet connection. Engage your brain with fun puzzles and collect tons of cute characters. Trust me, with over 100 million downloads, this 5-star rated mobile puzzle game is a must-play. Download Best Fiends, free in the Apple App Store or in Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Hi everyone, I wanted to tell you about BetterHelp Online Counseling. It's an affordable service where you can connect with one of their licensed professional therapists. You can find counselors that specialize in anxiety, depression, stress, relationships, trauma, grief, or LGBT issues. I work from home and don't often like to leave my house, so I really appreciate that you can communicate with your counselor from the privacy of your home. There's no need to sit in an uncomfortable waiting room. So many people have been using BetterHelp that they're recruiting additional counselors in all 50 states. It's more affordable than traditional offline counseling. You can start talking with your counselor in less than 24 hours. So if you've been thinking about getting counseling, there's never been a better time, because listeners will get 10% off their first month by visiting betterhelp.com/beyondcontempt. Join over 1 million people taking charge of their mental health. Again, that's betterhelp.com/beyondcontempt. Now, back to the show. It was October 19th, 1992, when a 23-year-old named Laura Houghteling did not show up for work and was reported missing. Laura was born on April 8th, 1969, in Bethesda, Maryland, to parents Frederick and Penelope. Unfortunately, Frederick never got to see his daughter grow up and turn into the bright young Harvard graduate that she would become. He passed away in 1986 when she was in grade school. Laura returned home after college to live with her mother in Bethesda. During this time, Hadden Clark was homeless. He lived out of his 1983 Datsun truck and often camped in the woods. He could not keep a steady chef job, so Penelope, who was a psychiatric social worker, gave him a job doing gardening work. She had met him through her church, and even though he was odd, she thought he could use an opportunity. The weekend Laura disappeared, her mother had been out of town attending a conference. A woman was seen leaving the Houghteling residence at 8:45 a.m. on October 19th, but this person was likely not Laura, because her work hours would have had her out the door much earlier. Laura's friends started searching for her, and her brother saw Hadden Clark driving around. He tried to get Clark to stop so he could ask about his sister. As he moved towards the passenger side door of the truck, Clark peeled away. The Bethesda police got in contact with the Montgomery Police Department, who had handled Michelle Dorr's case, and let them know that Hadden Clark was linked to another disappearance. On October 23rd, police found a bloody fingerprint on Laura's pillowcase, along with bloody bedding that was located in the woods by Laura's home. They brought Clark in for questioning the next day. When they asked him both about Michelle and Laura's disappearances, Clark started crying, and he got down on his knees and said he wanted to die. He was concerned that he might have blacked out and done a terrible thing. That is when law enforcement believed he committed both murders. The female seen leaving the Houghteling residence was Clark, dressed as a woman. One detective suggested to Laura's mom that Hadden Clark had been involved. She had difficulty believing it. The crimes were very similar, with the hiding of the bodies, the cleaning of the crime scenes, and his similar reactions in each police interview. Hadden Clark was now the principal person of interest. On November 6, 1992, police brought him in for an interview that lasted 7.5 hours. The officers took turns interrogating Clark. They didn't care what it took to break him. If he asked them for a lawyer, they didn't care. He wasn't getting one. It was reported that he asked for an attorney over 100 times and was denied by the investigators. Clark also claimed that they assaulted him during the interrogation. Later on in trial, both the prosecutor and judge stated that this interrogation was inappropriate and one of the worst that they had ever seen. Beyond the tainted and unconstitutional aspects of the interrogation, Clark's interview was highly irregular because of his schizophrenia diagnosis. He acted like 3 different people who took turns speaking. His other 2 personalities were a child and a woman. Clark's female persona told the police that she buried the bodies in New Jersey, where she grew up as a child. They searched the place in New Jersey, but they found no bodies. In Clark's truck, they found an eyeglass case full of dirt, and they found a map of the Wellfleet Cemetery, which was the Clark family plot. Police took cadaver dogs there, along with ground-penetrating radar, The dogs hit on something, and the soil appeared to have been disturbed, but they discovered no bodies. They asked Clark what he was doing, digging around that cemetery since his eyeglass case was full of dirt. Clark suggested that maybe it was a dog looking for some bones. Around this time, the analysis of the bloody pillowcase was complete, and it confirmed that the fingerprint belonged to Hadden Clark. He was subsequently charged with Laura Houghteling's murder. In January 1993, they searched a property that was owned by Clark's grandfather, but they still didn't find her body. On June 14, 1993, Hadden Clark pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 30 years. Even though Laura's body was missing, the prosecution had a strong case against him. Part of his plea deal stated that he did not have to tell authorities where the body was buried, and the Houghtelings were okay with this because the details were too painful. Police estimated that Clark killed Laura when she was still in bed, then he buried her. Clark's attorney said that Laura was a threat to his relationship with Laura's mother because he viewed her as a mother figure. Clark volunteered to show law enforcement where he buried Laura. She was found in a shallow grave near her home, which was located close to Clark's campsite in the woods. Now police turned to Michelle Dorr's case and considered Hadden Clark to be the prime suspect. Police met with Carl to discuss the details of his daughter's disappearance again. When they asked Carl about the last time he saw his daughter, he originally thought it was 2:10 p.m., but rationalized that it was likely an earlier time that day. He felt shame and guilt for leaving her alone for so long and not checking on her sooner. That would have given Clark enough time to kill Michelle because he didn't clock into work until 2:46 p.m. While imprisoned, Clark spoke about Michelle's murder to at least 5 inmates. In August 1994, 2 inmates manipulated Clark by telling him they wanted to write about his life. They figured he might be their ticket out of prison. So they asked him about Michelle Dorr's murder. Clark told them that he murdered the girl in his brother's home. He went up to his niece's room where Michelle was playing and brought a foot-long butcher knife. After he slashed Michelle, he put her in a trash bag. He stuffed that trash bag into his duffel bag and put it in the back of his truck. Clark cleaned up his niece's bedroom and threw out anything that had blood on it. From September 1995 to May 1996, Clark developed a friendship with another inmate named James Beckett. Clark admitted that he killed a girl named Michelle. He professed that he didn't mean to do it. Then he immediately changed the conversation because he didn't want to talk about it further. 18 months later, James picked up a newspaper and read about the disappearance of Michelle Dorr and realized that Clark was telling the truth. James immediately contacted the prosecutor. Clark was removed from his prison cell and taken for a police interrogation. They brought him to the same room that he had been in back in November 1992 when he was denied a lawyer. The detective warned Clark that he was going to receive the same poor treatment he got last time he was interviewed. Clark swore that he never said a word about Michelle's murder to any of the inmates. He admitted to detectives he knew Michelle was his niece Elizabeth's friend, and that he went to his brother's house the day she disappeared because his brother asked him to leave and he was moving his stuff out. When he was at the house, he didn't speak with anyone. But this contradicted his original statement where he let someone in to use the phone. Clark said he might have seen Michelle in the house when he was there. Police then went to the house to examine Elizabeth's room. They found 85 different spots that lit up with the aid of a black light and luminol. Unfortunately, the blood was too old to be tested properly. They charged Hadden Clark with the first-degree murder of Michelle Dorr and went to trial with no plea deals. Police believe that Michelle wandered over to Elizabeth's house looking for her playmate. Clark lured her inside and killed her because he was angry over his brother kicking him out of the house. Clark claimed that he ate some of her flesh, but this was never confirmed any other way, and Clark could have been retaining facts from his brother Bradford's crimes. On September 27, 1999, they swore the jury in for Hadden Clark's trial. Prosecution thought they had another strong case, even though Michelle's body had not been found. The prosecution's theory was that Clark buried Michelle at the Wellfleet Cemetery, but moved her body after his early interrogations. The defense used Carl as their alternative suspect, since he was not certain of the time when he last saw his daughter. He also made threats to his ex-wife about abducting Michelle. Their contention was that Clark did not have enough time to kill Michelle after 2 p.m., then arrive at work 45 minutes later via his bike. Hadden Clark was convicted of second-degree murder on October 18, 1999. 2 days later, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison, which he would serve consecutively with a sentence from Laura Houghteling murder. After Clark's conviction, he agreed to show police where Michelle was located. He took them to a ravine off Route 29 in Silver Spring, Maryland, where she was found in a wooded gravesite. The aftermath. Hadden Clark is currently incarcerated in Eastern Correctional Institution in Westover, Maryland. The FBI suspect that Hadden Clark has killed more people, but they have yet to produce any conclusive evidence to charge him with additional crimes. Carl's ex-wife, Dorothy, remarried and works as a LPN. Unfortunately, her marriage did not last. Losing her daughter was hard on her. A few months after Michelle went missing, she swallowed a healthy amount of Xanax. Dorothy called a TV station and declared that she didn't want to go on living. This was a cry for help. She believes that Carl did not harm their daughter, and the correct person is incarcerated. Carl Dorr remarried and works as a real estate appraiser. The experience of being a prime suspect for a murder he didn't commit has dissolved any trust that Carl has for police. He carries an immense amount of guilt for letting his daughter out of his sight for so long the day she went missing. Above all, Carl is happy that Michelle could be laid to rest in their family's burial plot. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Beyond Contempt. Please visit beyondcontemptpodcast.com for links to the sources used in this episode. Shout out to Pia O from Instagram for donating to the show. And thank you to Jan for upping your Patreon support. Your merch was mailed out this week. This episode was researched by Haley Gray. Scriptwriting, editing, and all audio production were performed by me. If you like the show, please leave me a favorable review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much, everyone.